We at the Co-Intelligence Institute are a non-profit organization with a vision of a world that works for all. A world where all human affairs are guided by wisdom that partners with all life and works for long-term broad benefit. So what we do, we focus on two key areas. We research and advocate for what we call co-intelligence. This is a term coined by CII's founder, Tom Attlee, who is with us tonight. And that term is a result of an ongoing inquiry into the question, what does intelligence look like if we take wholeness, interconnectedness, and co-creativity seriously? Secondly, we promote and foster collective sense-making and collaborative governance at all levels, and we call this wise democracy. So there's a mutual process whereby we are learning from the wise work that others are doing in the world, and we also support others to explore how they can apply various approaches, patterns, and principles to their works and their lives. And the way we do that is that we share real life stories, case studies of other people's good work, and approaches to the complex challenges of our time that we feel demonstrate co-intelligence. We promote and develop tools like pattern languages, group processes, and digital platforms that invoke and engage greater collective wisdom. And last but not least, we welcome people into learning communities, like on this call today, where we can all deepen our understanding of co-intelligence and develop our capacity for wise relating and living well together. So these monthly community learning calls are designed for us all to learn from and with practitioners that we feel are on the leading edge of what we call real-world co-intelligence. We want to highlight the work of these practitioners, whilst also engaging in a collaborative process of reflecting and learning from their experiences. So that brings us to our call tonight. So the program for this evening's learning call is, and Natalia, if you could post that, I think you've already posted it in the chat, so everybody can have a look here. We'll be first of all hearing from Professor Russell Razzaque about open dialogue and some of the connections and ramifications that has for society and democracy. Then we'll hear from Tom Attlee from the Co-Intelligence Institute, offering some reflections, drawing on patterns from the Wise Democracy Pattern Language, which is a tool that helps us to generalize and illuminate some of the insights that we've gained from good practice. And after that, we'll give you all a chance to discuss in breakout groups. So everybody will go into breakout groups of 3 people, and we'll be inviting you to think about what you've heard and discuss. And we'll be asking you these 3 questions that are in the chat there. I'll come back to those questions later. And in the final half hour, we'll have a brief report back from some of the groups and your discussions. And then we'll give some time to Russell to respond to the comments and questions, as many as we get time for, because we have obviously quite a large number of people on the call today. And then what we like to do also, so the call finishes after 90 minutes. And then we like to do, for example, 7:30 p.m. UK time. We spend another half hour for anybody who wants to stay on the call afterwards, informal hangout time. Anybody wants to stay and chat with us. Friends of CII. Okay. I think there's a little bit of background noise. If any.
Everyone could just make sure to mute their mute for now. Thanks.
Brilliant. So that's a little bit about CII and the call for this evening. So with that, I want to move on to introduce our featured guest today. Welcome, Professor Russell Razzaque. Russell is going to talk to us about open dialogue, an exciting, evidence-based, compassionate, holistic, and we at CII would say co-intelligent approach to treating intense mental health crises. Russell's a psychiatrist based in London, England, and also an open dialogue trainer. He's currently leading the world's largest randomized controlled trial on the implementation of open dialogue for National Health Service in the UK. He's a visiting professor at the London South Bank University, and he's also a writer. He's written columns for a number of publications, including Psychology Today, The Independent, Guardian, USA Today, and he's an author. One of his publications is a fascinating book exploring the connections between psychological distress and spiritual awakening. He's also a mindfulness trainer, and something that we're going to cover in today's discussion is that he's a long-time advocate for more participatory and dialogical forms of democracy. And also, just on a personal note, a few years ago, Russell supported me personally at the beginning of a participatory democracy project that started in an East London borough. So welcome, Russell. It's great to have you with us this evening.
Thanks, Andy. Great to be here. Great to see you again. Spend time with you again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, we'd love to hear from you. If you could sort of, for people, I understand there's probably quite a large number of people who may know about open dialogue on this call, but there's also quite a few that don't. So would you be able to talk us through the principles behind it, what it is, where it originated? That'd be great, first of all.
Sure. So I guess we can start, I suppose it started in northern Finland, where they had some of the worst outcomes in the world, actually, in mental health care. They had some of the highest relapse rates, some of the highest suicide rates. So that gave them the opportunity, really, to basically close down most of their services and restart from scratch. And they set up a series of experiments, one of which is called open dialogue. And what they did is that they basically had the actually well known about notion that mental health difficulties don't really happen in someone's head. If you want to make a major change, you need to be working with the people in the network around them. And just taking someone out of their context and working with them, putting them back again, is a recipe for sort of lifelong, revolving door coming in and out of the system. So what they did is they trained all their staff to work dialogically with a range of people who are around the patient. So that would be their family members, their friends, their colleagues. The first question they ask is, who else is helpful to you? Who else can join the meetings? And they set up things called network meetings, which were very much about folks coming together. And really, co-intelligence is the right word, really, pooling their own wisdom together to try and understand what's happening. Now, in order to do that, you need to train clinicians and staff in the mental health services to think and work very differently, because there's two flaws, if you like, in the way that our services approach people. One is that we just see the problems existing in someone's head, so we just take them out on their own. The other is we have a very paternalistic top-down model of care culture in our system, where people come to the doctor or nurse to get healed, and then we dispense our wisdom and medication and get them better. But what we do is we try and train staff, A, to emphasize the bringing together of a community. That every crisis is an opportunity to bring a community together. And secondly, to flatten the hierarchy so that we can really form genuine partnerships. So forging a partnership with somebody's friends and family is more than what we'd normally do, which is just give them some information or gain information from them. It's about saying, you know what, you know as much about this as I do. And so let's put our heads together and see what we can come up with. And we want to start by creating a culture in which everybody can say their own piece. We're not looking for consensus from the beginning. We're not looking for people to sort of quickly forge agreements on things. We just want to hear where everybody is, where's everybody's voice in this. And that requires quite a bit of training in the healthcare system that is very dominated by, let's provide quick top-down solutions for people. And unfortunately, that culture of providing quick top-down solutions is what leads to people bouncing back so often into our system. So what the Finns found when they started this is that actually long-term, people were getting better and not coming back to services at much higher rates than anywhere else. And so people with very severe breakdowns, psychosis, and things were ending up actually getting back to work or study, something like 10 times higher amounts than in the rest of Europe. And now most academics and policy makers could dismiss that because it wasn't randomized. So when I learned about it and I started to take it around to sort of senior leaders in the NHS, their answer was, well, it's not randomized, so it could be the weather. It could have, their outcomes could have changed because of the water or something. So for that, in order to try and break through that, I then set up the first big RCT, as you said, in open dialogue. And it's a very large trial, which is now running across 6 different NHS trusts. And we're sort of small pilot teams, and we're comparing those outcomes to a randomized other team. Just about to finish the evaluation period, and now we're going to start crunching numbers to see if it really has made that much difference. If we reproduce a fraction of the difference that the Finns found, then it will be a game changer for the whole NHS. But what I've always thought, and we've talked about this for many years, Andy, is that this is sort of one part of a wider societal shift that's needed. I've always thought that this is just one part of a change, because we need really to change so many things about how society works. I've been very, over the years, I've come to become increasingly disillusioned with our political systems. We elect 300 people to represent all of us all of the time, and we have one vote every 4 years. It makes no sense whatsoever. When we're now in a society where we've got access to all the information, we can help make decisions for ourselves. Why aren't we doing that? Why don't we have a system that involves collaboration and participation? Why don't we have a more dialogical system of governance? And so actually that bringing everybody together in a partnership model should also be something that we're using to govern our systems, and also to govern ourselves politically. So it just seems like this is the next stage, if you like, in human evolution. And probably no better place to start it off, actually, than in the mental health system, where historically and currently, people are often oppressed instead of heard. There's a reflex to sort of try to remove people's distress instead of learn from it, and enable people to contribute, as a result. So it's a very interesting time. I feel like this is one part of a wider picture, and I'm very committed to all levels of that. But I think it's what's really great is that we've spent years now training about 500 or 600 staff across the UK and around the world, and we just see how it really opens people up. I mean, the first stage is really opening up to yourself. So we do a lot of self-work. The training involves lots of mindfulness and other things that people do to open themselves up. And once you open yourself up to be present with all of your different voices and emotions and contradictions, then it's easier to do that with other people. And so there's a direct line between working on ourselves, working with our friends and families, working on our own health and our emotions, and working with our society more broadly as well. I think all of those things kind of go together. And so I see this as part of a wider movement, really, which is what brings us here. Yeah. That gives you a bit of a background.
That's fantastic. Yes. It'd be wonderful to, so you sort of give us a bit of background there about how it started off in Lapland and what you're doing here in the UK. Would it be possible to sort of, would you be able to talk us through some of the principles that underline what you're doing in open dialogue, and what it might look like as well? What is the actual sort of therapeutic process, and how, what might a session look like, and how many sessions would there be, or that kind of detail?
Sure.
Really interesting.
So it's really all about openness. So at early stages, if somebody's referred into an open dialogue team, so say we've had 6 open dialogue pilot services across the NHS, we tend to take people who are in crisis. So we wanted to prove. People will sometimes say, oh, this is all very well, but it must be for people who are not that unwell. And we say, well, actually, the trial deliberately was organized in a way that made sure that actually the people who need the most higher level of care, who have the most needs, are the ones who we see in open dialogue. So if you're randomized to an open dialogue service, then you come into service if you're in crisis. The first thing that's different is that staff really ask, but who else is involved in your life who you'd like to bring into your care? And the interesting thing is that if you look at surveys across the country of people who use our services, when they're asked the questions, a loved one or someone that's important to me is as involved in my care as I would like, less than 50% say yes to that. So half the people who use mental health services have people who they would love to be involved in their care, but they were never even asked. So the first thing is we ask. There'll be a lot of emphasis on trying to ask and bring people into the room and formulate that first network meeting. Or there's people in some places call it listening meetings, which I really like because it's also a really good way of describing it. And then we train our staff into how to conduct those meetings, which is very much about making sure every voice is heard. And there's certain techniques that we'll use to do that. I know obviously won't go through all of it, but a couple of simple ones are just asking very, very open questions at the beginning, not even saying how are you or what's the problem, but what led to us being here today. Just being as open as possible the way you open a meeting, and then later on in the meeting reflecting. So usually we try to encourage having 2 members of staff in a network meeting, and they then might say to the network, do you mind if we turn to each other and have a conversation about what we're hearing, and you can tell us what you think when you've heard that. So we're not going to go out of the room and have a separate conversation. We're not going to make decisions without you. We have a sort of bit of a slogan we use, nothing about us without us. So we have that conversation together. We turn to each other. We have the reflection together about what we're hearing, what our anxieties might be, and most importantly, how we might empathize with what we've heard. That's the most important reason for reflection early on. Like, how did it affect you? How did it impact you in an embodied way, hearing what you've heard? Because vast majority of times there's some deep trauma and difficult experiences in people's lives that will begin to come out through these meetings. So we have those reflections, and then we ask the network to reflect on what they've heard from those reflections. Then we can carry the dialogue on, and then we teach our staff different ways to keep the talking going, keep the dialogue going with each other, as well as about their own positions. So we can get as much openness as possible. We're trying to create a safe space in which people feel able to express, design and sort of construct their own narrative, their own understanding, not something that we've imposed on them, but something that they have understood by their own dialogue. And so we might be silent a lot of the time, which might feel awkward to clinicians who've been in the system for many years, but you start to realize that actually you're doing a lot just by being silent, just by creating that space. So the safe space is absolutely fundamental. And very often when we do this work, I've been doing it for 10, 15 years now, and interestingly, in almost every case, within a meeting or two, people will start saying, I've never said these things before. Often it'll be, I've never said these things before to anyone in the system, so to anybody in the health service. But actually very often it'll be, I've never said these things before to anybody. So there'll be things that have been sitting inside all this time. And we had a fantastic conference at SOAS on Monday, and in there was somebody who'd had open dialogue meetings, and he put it beautifully, which was that when I started to articulate some things about my life, what I realized was that it wasn't seen as awful by people in the way that I had judged myself. So the self-judgment is very hard to do when you bring it out into the light, because the loved ones around you can reassure you and receive it with love and compassion. So the shift starts happening as a result of that, just the ability to unburden yourself. And unfortunately, the way our mental health systems tend to work is that we tend to put a sticking plaster over a wound without ever creating a space to open that wound. So we do that, and then we wonder why they keep coming back, because the wound keeps festering. But what we try and do in open dialogue is create that open space where what's underlying it, often some very difficult stories, starts to come out. And we don't push anyone to do that, right? We don't say you must open up and say more, or we just create a space in which they might feel safe enough to say it. And usually they do, but if they don't, that's also fine. We're not here to push anybody, but we're here to create that space where people feel able and comfortable to do that. And that's why continuity of care is another key aspect of the system. I was just giving a talk to medical directors in Manchester and the northwest of England earlier today, and I talked about how we have created a system that's like a conveyor belt. So you have people who come into mental health services, go to one team, then another team, then another team. Relationships are perpetually being broken, and this is the exact opposite of how you deliver relational care. And they all agreed, they all unanimously agreed that we've designed a terrible system here. And I was able to tell them that actually the academics who designed that system themselves openly speak about how they feel guilty about creating the system, because they realize that it's not something that is conducive to relationships. It's actually relationships are anathema in this system. It's just been completely forgot about. So putting relationships first means having better continuity of care. It means training staff to focus on the relationship. It means, for example, in our open dialogue services, we had something called an open door discharge. Once you're discharged from our services, you need to know that you can come back anytime. And please we urge you to come back whenever you feel any kind of difficulty. So if your dog dies, something happens, you could come and see us before you become unwell, so that we can have some meetings together. And that might stay off them. and we'll try and do our best to get you to see the same people that you then see, you've then been seeing. So it's almost like a lifelong relationship, even though they've been discharged. Maintaining that relationship is absolutely key. And one thing that we've already found, you don't normally announce the results of a study before it's even finished, but there's something we've already been announcing, really, because it's so stark, which is that in the open dialogue teams, staff retention is way higher than in the control group now. So, for example, where I work in Havering, there's 100% turnover of staff since 2017. Everybody in the team now was not in the team in 2017. They're all new. In the open dialogue team, we've had about 20% turnover of staff, and that's mainly because if you want to get promoted, it's a small team. You've got to leave the team to get to another level. So that's only an artifact of this sort of small pilot system. Whereas if it was ubiquitous, then that would even the 20% wouldn't exist. So we have a 100% turnover versus a 20% turnover. So there's a 5 times lower turnover of staff, 5 times higher retention rate in the open dialogue team compared to the treatment as usual control group. And that has been consistently found across all of our trial teams. Now, this is a bit of a holy grail to the NHS because in 2021, we lost more staff from the NHS than in the history of the NHS, which is not surprising post-pandemic, given the trauma that staff had to go through as a result of that. So now trying to retain staff is a big goal, and we know that will be one of the findings of the trial. There's no question about that. It's a massive difference. So yeah, so it's something that's good for us. You know, working this way is good for us, and working this way isn't just about training methodology and techniques. It's especially about working on ourselves, as I mentioned earlier, and we encourage the teams to keep doing that on a regular basis. They keep doing self-work, and by that time the team gets to know themselves really well, gets to know each other really well, working solidly as a team. So that personal development, my own slogan is personal development, no professional development without personal development. So that's key. I've just been a big slogan of mine, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, where I also have a role now, leadership role. So yeah, that's basically what it kind of looks like, and it's very promising in terms of the future, but a very, very substantial culture shift to how our services work at the moment, and we're trying to demonstrate that it does make a big difference.
Yes, it sounds very moving, actually, that you're creating a space where you're removing all of these assumptions, the prejudgment. You're not having sort of people who are there in white coats, sort of with the clipboards, diagnosing people. It's kind of sounds like healing through a space of creating a field of sort of openness in the room. Yeah, something that comes to mind is the sort of Zen mind, beginner's mind sort of thing of like removing all preconceptions and like meeting people, and that allows things to come up, like you just said, of people saying things that they'd never said before. So we're going to move on in a bit, but what I would like to ask you then is just sort of how you feel that might transfer and translate. How could we transfer some of those principles and your learnings into the field of democracy, dialogical democracy? What might that look like? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess the first thing to say about beginner's mind, you're absolutely right. That's fundamental to how open dialogue should work, which is that, there's a big difference between asking somebody a series of questions with a checkbox in your mind, or, even a direction of travel in your mind, and being completely open in your mind in terms of, let's go where this goes. And that you're absolutely right, that beginner's mind. And interestingly, I wrote a paper in my early days of open dialogue about how there's a big actual overlap between mindfulness and open dialogue. And the originators of open dialogue hadn't really thought of that until they read my paper. And oh, you're right, actually, we didn't realize. A lot of embodiment, a lot of talking about connections with our body, a lot of talking about the open sort of mindedness, and having beginner's mind all the way through is fundamental. It's a big culture change. How do we bring that into our democracy? I mean, I believe that we are in the process of evolution in terms of how we see ourselves and govern ourselves as a species. And at every major junction, we also risk extinction. So I think that we are at a phase now where, as a species, we could make ourselves extinct, or we could go to a different level. And it's dependent on this fundamental thing, whether it's ultimately potential destruction through conflict, through climate change, through other things. All of those are possibilities if we don't change something very fundamental, which is how we govern ourselves. Because hundreds of years ago, or 1,000 years ago, we used to believe that a king had divine right to rule over us. So, we would basically obey the rules that were passed down to us from the monarch and the aristocracy. And then we learned, the printing press came about, and to read, more and more people realized that, this is, it's a bit of a fallacy to think that there's one person who has a divine right, we're all human beings. So then we moved towards a representative system of democracy where we elect a few hundred people to make all the decisions for us. But now, we've gone through another evolution where there's a lot more information. You have at your fingertips everything you need. There's so much opinions out there. There's the ability to really understand. I do not believe that anybody who sits on the government bench knows more than anybody in this meeting right now about fundamental issues of governance, right? Whether it's about how we organize our mental health system or our school system or our prison system. I think we've all got the ability to contribute to understanding that. And so therefore, I think a participatory democracy or a dialogical democracy is what we need to get to next. And I think the desire for that is what is underneath so many eruptions right now. That's what leads to things like Brexit and Trump, because people don't trust the current system. People are very cynical about politicians today and representative democracy in general. And it's like we're going through these convulsions because we can't really fit in this system anymore, where we have this system where just a tiny, tiny percentage of people are deciding things for all of us. And we know it's not right, and we're really angry about it, and we're rebelling against it. And we do crazy things like vote Trump in and stuff because we can't stand this, and we feel we're locked out. But the solution really is, obviously it's not Trump or any of those things, but the solution is, rethinking the way we govern ourselves. And going back to the original descriptions of democracy, this is not really a democracy, which involves everybody participating. And the wonderful thing is now that technology enables us to do that, right? Where we can actually all have a say. There are many ways to do this, and there's examples around the world of citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, and all sorts of innovations like that, where people can come together to consider a policy, consider an issue. Ireland did some wonderful things, right, around their abortion laws and gay marriage and other things. And they came together. They brought, folks from across the country together to start having these debates. And then once they did that, they put it out to a referendum. There's examples of this dotted around, right? And there's a realization at some levels of governance that we kind of have to do this. It can't be that we have a wholly polarized society and then we expect politicians to come together and make decisions, from that. Actually, we have to come together everywhere, right? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of our culture pushes us away from that. We get heaved into watching reality TV and trying to forget about, what's really happening. But the truth is, we're all affected by it, and we all want to have a say at the end of the day. I think we really need to evolve our systems of democracy. I think, some representation will be needed, but at the same time, we also really need to have systems where we've got the ability to bring people together to make major decisions and contribute to that, and have hive mind and co-intelligence. And there's lots of ways of describing this, where we tap into the intelligence of everybody. I remember before I discovered open dialogue, I was a mindfulness teacher, a mindfulness practitioner, and then I became a mindfulness teacher. And I remember hearing from Buddhist monks for years who I would go to retreats with. I remember one of them telling me about how he, in Sri Lanka, he was a monk there, and he would, do pastoral work for the people in his local area. And he would say that my main emphasis was just to be present and in the moment with their distress and what they're bringing to me. Because when you do that, when you really sit in the moment, it's like a new kind of intelligence emerges from between you. And that always stuck with me. And this is why as soon as I saw open dialogue, it clicked, like, this is what they're doing. The exact same thing. And it's the same thing as if we bring lots of minds together, then a new intelligence will emerge that enables us to start to think about things. And you can think about that spiritually, or you can think about that not at all spiritually, right? It can simply be just a psychological construct. However you see it, it's essential really in terms of governing ourselves. We can't expect this dude Rishi Sunak and about 17 other people around the table to decide everything about how we run our lives and what we do about climate change and when we bring in electric cars. There should be contributions from across the system, and we can do that. And there's we talked before about Polis and other pieces of software that now enable that sort of rolling dialogues to happen and people to contribute. And of course, there's embodied ways of doing this through sort of talk cafes and other things like that. So I really think that we need to shift to that. I think the dialogical model of care for mental health care It's just one part, as I say, of a wider continuum that we need to move towards in society as a whole. And I honestly believe, and I'm not being alarmist here, I think honestly believe if we don't, then we will basically end ourselves in the species. I think we can realize we can't make the right decisions in the way that we're going at the moment. And there's so many massive cliffs that we could fall off, that we will probably fall off one of them at some point, unless we shift the way in which we make decisions and govern ourselves. And I think there's a sort of understanding of that underneath, but it hasn't, all the dots haven't been connected yet for folks. Yeah. So I think those of us who have some experience of this in our work and our mental health services have a bit of a duty to try to promote that as well outside. Yeah, so I think, this is how I connect all of these things up and how I see the importance of this. I think it's absolutely crucial now for the future.
Well, thanks for giving us that sort of evolutionary perspective. Either we evolve or we perish. Thank you. It's quite a big juncture that we're at now, and it feels like the things that you're explaining there that sound really, really important and relevant. Yeah, and CII, we're looking into all of these innovations and around how we might govern ourselves differently. So thank you, Russell, for talking about open dialogue, the connections with democracy there. What we're going to do now is we're going to shift. We're going to come back to you again later on. We're going to give people a chance. We're going to give Tom a chance to reflect first, and then we're going to give others a chance to go into breakout groups, and then we'll come back to you at the end, Russell. So thanks very much for your input and your presentation there, which is really very inspiring. And now we're going to hand over to Tom, who's going to reflect on what we've heard and relate that to the theory and patterns of co-intelligence and wise democracy. So handing over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Andy. Wow. I love everything I'm hearing about open dialogue. I need to start my timer to see if I can jam all this into 10 minutes or so. I went over what we call the wise democracy pattern language, which has 96 guiding principles for designing a wise democracy. And I discovered 56 of those patterns. It's almost unprecedented. 56 of those patterns that relate directly to what open dialogue is all about, which is fascinating with the resonance. And also, perhaps even more significantly, is there's a principle that we call the prime directive, which underlies all of the wise democracy patterns, all these design principles, which is the prime directive is to appreciate, evoke, and engage the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole. So we see in open dialogue where the whole is, it's a small contained whole, but here is the person who's in crisis, here is the networks, the people, actual or potential support people for that person, and the therapists are sort of make a whole system there, and you're trying to design it and run it in a way where you appreciate, you evoke, and you engage the wisdom and resourcefulness that sort of already exists in a potential form in that whole on behalf of that whole. And I just go, wow, that is one of those beautiful examples of the prime directive we run across. I want to note that first, then I'll go over a couple of the or half dozen of the patterns that I found really resonated. The first obviously is whole system in the conversation, and the whole system in the room is a phrase that comes out of business organizational development, but the sense of what we want is to bring all the different pieces that are co-creating whatever the situation is together in conversation. So each pattern has what we call a heart, which is about 50-word description. And for the whole system of the conversation, it says conditions, both desirable and undesirable, are co-created by all the players involved, directly or contextually. They create context for things. To the extent these diverse people, interests, and perspectives are brought into creative interaction, wise outcomes can be co-created because you have all the different things you need to take into account. So think seriously about who or what else should be part of any given conversation. So this is the thinking that went into, okay, we're going to have a therapeutic thing. What would be the whole system for a therapeutic activity? And that's the open dialogue has gone, very far in finding that useful. You can always extend it. But I'm just saying the whole system of the conversation is one of the patterns that's sort of in mind by the people who are working in it. And another, which is really obvious, is experts on tap, not on top. To the extent expert knowledge is diverse, accessible, unpretentious, and well contextualized, it can help generate democratic wisdom by clarifying situational dynamics and likely outcomes of various options. The experts do have something to say. They've studied this kind of thing a lot. And so you bring them into interaction with each other and with the other players in the system. You can get that expert knowledge to help people apply their own expertise about values, everyday experience. What's it like for the person who's receiving the therapy? What's their life like? The experts can help them think about that to make wise decisions individually and collectively. So that happened in a democracy, that happened in a therapy session. And, it's just some of the most obvious ones. And feeling heard is another one. The experience in citizen dialogues and deliberations, the sense of if people feel heard, they relax. If they're unheard, they'll withdraw, they'll attack. It makes real communication collaboration hard when people, just the fact of feeling unheard. But when they feel heard, they relax, they open up, they start to hear what other people are thinking about and be able to work with them. And this happens, we can see it in relationships, we can see it in groups, we can see it in whole societies, the power of feeling heard. And reflective, active listening, saying, am I getting it? What's going on with you? The sense of curiosity and checking with people how they are feeling about what's going on, which is open dialogue is filled with that. And multiple perspective view. The heart in this case says every conflict or issue has at least two self-legitimizing sides, and usually more. Their stories contain energies and information vital to a healthy shared future. So compassionately hear and make visible in a compelling manner the spectrum of perspectives, both to evoke empathy and to help everyone see what needs to be taken into account for truly wise solutions. So we see that really vividly in the open dialogue. They're inviting in multiple perspectives, all of which have something to do with this person or problem. But it's a much bigger perspective that you get. And once people hearing each other, you get a bigger sense of what it is that's going on and what will be needed to handle it. And partnership culture is the other one. There's this phrase in terms of partnership culture, because we're in the Wise Democracy Project, we're looking at, the larger culture, so it's phrased in that way. But the search for long-term broad benefit, which is a definition of wisdom, is long-term broad benefit, requires the shared openness and energy of all participants. You can't do shared broad benefit with just one or two perspectives. And competition is part of it, but cooperation and mutual aid need to be the dominant themes. So realize the power of conscious collegiality, nurture awareness that treats everyone, everything, and every situation as a potential partner. It's the whole partnership is not just two people working together, it's a whole perspective of what we're doing here in the world. That we working with, and there's power with, there's intelligence with, there's a lot of witness that you can develop that spirit, and that's definitely what's going on in the open dialogue. And I was very warmed and intrigued and provoked to want a more conversation with Russell and his colleagues when saying that open dialogue is one part of that's needed in our societies. And why don't we have more dialogic systems of governance? It leads me to another pattern that is really interesting. It's called the whole healing pattern. And when I was going over this over and over this list of 96 patterns, looking about what kinds of resonance there were between this open dialogue and the Wise Democracy work, and I kept bumping to the whole healing pattern. Arises from many sources, undermining clear presence and responsiveness. collective dynamics of war, poverty, oppression, cultural narratives, damaging environments, dance, personal histories, beliefs, behaviors. Getting out, my internet is not sufficient here. I'll keep going now. So he has this contextual, collective dynamics, creating context, and also personal histories, beliefs, behaviors, psychology, genetics, all dancing in somebody's life. So work towards healing people and their context, individual and collective, physical, social, narrative, and natural life spaces. So I'm really intrigued with how open dialogue might expand even within the dialogue itself. There is the closest thing I've come to in this, I think it's a branch of narrative psychology in Australia that has been done with the indigenous people there, looking at the oppressive dynamics that they're living in. And instead of what you need to, be a better person, it's like you are surviving against all these forces that are working against you. You are actually really powerful people. Half the middle class people were faced with you face, they never get anywhere. So there's a sense of empowerment. And what are we going to do with the larger systems that are doing this? And Paulo Freire in South America also had a similar kind of approach. And I'm curious how just an inquiry, how open dialogue, there might be experiments with people who are doing open dialogue to see what might we do to expand, what is the whole system? How can we address the larger systemic dynamics that are also part, like in what's the practice of restorative justice is another one. Instead of having this is the criminal, it's like, what is the larger context that facilitates them being, doing the actions that they did and being seen as a criminal, and how do we include all that in the conversation too? So that's an inquiry I have, open dialogue and its potential future. That's all. I'll stop now.
And I think, Tom, thanks so much, Tom. I think you also said you have a document that you'd be sharing with us as well. I think you can post that into the chat, that with some of the patterns that you've shared and some inquiries around open dialogue as well.
I'm gonna post about 35 patterns into the chat.
Okay.
Just you can scan over them and get a feel for what sorts of things and how they relate with this thing that we just heard of.
Fantastic.
So I'll do that and you can move on at the same time.
So thanks, Tom. So we are now going to open it up to everybody to discuss what they've heard so far today. We're going to put you into randomly assigned breakout rooms of roughly 3 people in each. We want to, there'd be enough space for you to talk. We're going to give you 15 minutes, and we're going to invite you to think about the following questions. So what insights did this provoke for yourself, for your communities, and society at large? How might what you've heard relate to or impact your own work? And what do you have questions about or would love to hear more about? And so if you want to make notes, you're very welcome to. When you come back, we'll be hearing from a few groups. We'll invite you to put some of the insights and questions into the chat, and then we'll give Russell once again a chance to comment on some of the things that people are saying. So Natalia, do we have...
I want to add a note, but first, if anybody wants stuff out of the chat so far, you might want to save the chat, because when you come back, that chat will not be available to you.
Good point. Yeah,
If
you can
want to do a save and then you'll be back.
Yeah, there should be a button there that helps you to save the chat.
Right.
We can save it as well and share it with everybody after the event as well. We'll follow up with an email to make sure everybody gets that. Okay, Natalia, would you be able to open up? Thank you.
Yes, I had a really good conversation with Ram and Sarabi. And we were reflecting on, you had a question about what were the resources required up front, and were they the barrier to actually doing that? And I don't know if Ramin wants to come in, but it was really interesting to just sort of talk back about how although you had the costs that you had in bringing this together was so offset by the benefits, which were multiple, and they were coming in very quickly. And in fact, Russell alluded to one of them about the 100% retention practically. And we were talking a little bit about how you would bring that into a civic environment. And I actually don't see that it's that difficult. The more I think about it, I just think it can just be done. And we were talking about the civic forums, but I might leave it to Ramin because he kind of was raised the question, so maybe he's got more of an answer from what we were talking about. Thank you.
I don't know about answers, but I will jump in and echo. What we were struck by was an open dialogue invites folks to bring the best version of themselves into the conversation. It creates that space where all of us is welcome, and that shared yearning for a civics that brought our best selves into conversation with each other and let us honestly put it all on the table, with the belief that our empathy and caring will naturally emerge to find the best ways forward. So maybe as a through line into Wise Democracy, there were some questions about citizen assemblies and to what extent there is a gap between the standard citizen assembly and the depth and the kind of the heart-centeredness that's emerging in open dialogue, and how we could bridge some of that work. So
that's a really interesting reflection, Ramin. I was having exactly the same conversation with Russell as you were in the breakout room. Mahiba.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was with Sarah, and what she was saying was exactly what was happening between us. I would like to thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much for bringing all these wonderful ideas which resonated so much with me. Being of my age, it simply took me back to how I was as a child. We didn't live as units, as single whatever. We lived as communities, and this is how we functioned. Each one seemed to have a role without being told or telling others what the role was. So we lived in a community. Today, the feeling I have politically, in terms of health or in terms of whatever, is that we are constantly told, if you listen to the news, we are constantly told how different we are. And we have a meeting like this one, we constantly feel how similar we are, how we think along the same lines. This is why meetings like this are so fascinating. And what Russell was saying resonated so much with me that I had the feeling that, well, that's me. Because you end up feeling that's exactly me. And what Russell was saying could be duplicated in practically every field. I used to be a professor, university professor, and now I'm a life coach, and I could apply everything that Russell says in coaching, and it works. That's exactly how it is: listening, empathy, giving space for the other, giving the chance for the other to express, and that is so fascinating. Duplicated in politics, we would be far, far better. And instead of having these top couple of them ruling us, we should have it the other way around. We should be the majority ruling over whoever seems to have some crazy ideas. Thank you so much. It's a fascinating session. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Mahiba. Anyone else? Maybe one more comment, question, and then we'll hand back to Russell. Anybody else? I see a few of you have put some comments into the chat.
I see Rosa's hand.
Oh, Rosa.
Yeah.
Rosa, I just want to acknowledge Rosa. She is the impetus behind these calls. She has been facilitating, holding these calls for the past few months, and is now a fellow at Harvard Ash Democracy School. So yeah, great to have you with us, Rosa. And what would you, love to hear your contribution.
Thank you, Andy. I just want to say I'm delighted with our guest and students, and I was sharing in my small group how when I first heard about open dialogue about a decade ago, in a trip to Austria, I was sharing with a colleague there, who some of you know, with Manfred Hellriegel, my excitement, and I said, if you have a few minutes, I want to play this video for you. And it was a video of Jaakko Sekula's Psychotic Meaning Making is Meaning Making, where he's talking about how everybody is attempting to make sense and to communicate in the best way that they know how. And Manfred, who was the director of public engagement in a state in Austria called Vorarlberg, he watched the whole video and then he looked at me and he smiled and he said, yes, I can see why you're so excited. These principles really are the same, of being able to listen deeply to each person and to experience what it's like to be in community together. So I am just delighted that I did not know that so much progress has been happening in England. I am delighted by the randomized study, so that this can really gain credibility. Delighted by the preliminary results of increased retention. And I just feel like there are so many parallels here on a deeper level in terms of the philosophy of deep listening and empathy. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosa. I see, Katie, you have your hand up. Do you have if you have a very brief comment, that would be great, because then I'd love to hand back to Russell. We've only got 12 minutes left on the call. So if you have a very brief comment, I'd love to hear that.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, briefly. I just wrote a draft of my third book on the topic of dialogue, and I want to thank you all, because I was feeling crazy, like this is not making any sense. And now it makes complete sense. So what I'd like is if you'd put anything in the chat, if you know of good publishers or agents for a book, or if you would like to read my draft and comment on it or anything like that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katie. I'm going to hand back to Russell. Any reflections on what you've heard there? Any responses to the questions that there might be in the chat? I haven't had a chance to go through the chat myself, but yeah, over to you, Russell.
Sure, yeah. So just to briefly touch on some of the points raised. I mean, there was a question earlier about resources and costs. We wanted from the beginning to make sure that this is not a more expensive way of delivering care, because what will happen is, if we prove this works, but it costs twice as much money, it'll just sit on a shelf somewhere as a publication and it will never actually be implemented. But we wanted to prove the costs are the same. The open dialogue teams don't have any more funding or any more capacity than the other teams. They're exactly equal. And we have a professor of health economics on our academic panel who is doing the evaluation. What we want to prove is that not only do you get better outcomes, but the costs are less, because people are bouncing back to the services less. This is why we had a 2-year follow-up for everybody recruited to the study. So we can see that over time, hopefully, because they come back less often to services, the actual overall cost is less. Even in the short term, the cost can be less, because people, when they have these meetings, they don't want to then get visited every day by new people who they've never met before, or go to hospital to be, just to be monitored. They would rather actually have these meetings, even if they're spaced out a bit. So we didn't have more staff, we didn't have more resources, but we did train people, and then we did organize our system differently. So that was key. But it was about the culture, it was about the way in which we met people. And I always say that you can work dialogically in any context. You may not do the whole of open dialogue, but you can do some of it everywhere. We did all of it in our open dialogue teams, pretty much. In terms of the intersection with citizens assembly and open dialogue, absolutely. So Andy and I were talking about this during the breakout rooms, that key is how to have an embodied connection with each other, right? Can you feel each other's emotions? And that's fundamental. So when we talk about citizens assemblies, participatory democracy, that emotional element is fundamental. And so there are many ways of doing these things, but we need to make sure that we do these things in a way in which we are not just hearing each other, but we're feeling each other. Most connection is not verbal, right? The majority of communication is non-verbal. And what that really is about us feeling who else is in the room. I always believe that we're always feeling each other, but the question is whether or not we let it in above the neck. It's whether or not we actually allow ourselves to connect to that and understand that. But we're always actually connecting to each other. In mental health, sometimes there's this fear that if we really open ourselves up, won't that really sort of burn us out? But the truth is, we're getting burnt out anyway because we are actually connecting, but we're denying it to ourselves. So what we really need to do is just simply open the connection to our bodies and be present with that, reflect that, share that, and bring that into the room. And that's how we can work through that. The interesting thing here, a question here about if there are any tie-ins with the work of David Bohm's proposal of dialogue. I'm very fascinated by David Bohm's work and by the Copenhagen quantum physicists and the whole realm of actually metaphysics in general, in terms of understanding, and my very small understanding of that is very much about how actually when you're really present and you're not thinking and intellectualizing and planning and trying to plot, then there is you are able to spontaneously come up with a lot more creativity and perhaps connect to something deeper. Jung talked about the collective unconscious. There's something that we can tap into if we're not in that thinking space, but we're in that truly present space. There's good research that shows that when we're having more creative experiences, the actual blood flow, the oxygenation of the brain is less. So when our cerebral cortex is working less, we're actually able to flow more creatively at those times, and it's fascinating to see that. So I'm in terms of connecting to democracy. For most of human history, we have not been hierarchical societies. Actually, for about 30,000 years of modern humans existing, in the last 30,000, the actual hierarchical civilization, if you like, where we organize ourselves into these governments and kings and then parliaments, didn't exist, right? And we did pretty well. We survived, and we were not on the verge of extinction all the time. And so there is something that is calling us back all the time. There is a way of being that has been around for most of our history as a species, and it's calling us back repeatedly, which is why open dialogue, for example, the Finns, a group of people in northern Finland, suddenly discovered this. But you look at, as was mentioned before, you look at indigenous tribes around the world, they do that anyway. You look at some outcomes for people with severe mental health problems in developing countries, and they're often better than in the West. Because actually what happens, first of all, is the community comes around it together than what happens in the Western world, where you have all these structures and layers and services around it. So it's fascinating, but I think there's that yearning within us to go back to that sort of collaborative, co-intelligent, methodology of running our lives and each other. And there's a yearning within us because actually that's always been how we have done things. And we've just got to this space now where we've sort of, it's crazy. Something like, I think something like eight people have the same wealth as about 3 billion people in the planet right now. So everything is perverted and skewed so much that it's extremely dangerous and it's not good for anybody really. So, but I think that we do have that harking within us to go back to these spaces. This is why it appears spontaneously in Finland, and then in different communities around the world they do different versions of this. And open dialogue is just one little a blip of that wider yearning within humankind and within our deeper intelligence. And you can take it, interestingly, you can, so for the folks who are into open dialogue, for me, I see open dialogue as one part of a continuum. That's how we organize our mental health system. But if you want to go into practicalities and wider society, then you can think about politics, participatory democracy, or you can take it into the spiritual. And my book, Breaking Down is Waking Up, is very much about that. And metaphysics and understanding consciousness. And for me, again, that this is also key. It's not necessarily part of dialogue, but it's part of my understanding of the world in terms of what we are, and awareness and consciousness. I've discovered a wonderful philosopher recently called Bernardo Castro, who I'm addicted to now, watching. He's got lots of stuff on YouTube. He's written many, many books. Fantastic philosopher. Analytical idealism is his.
What was his name? Sorry.
His name is Bernardo Castro. So I'll put his name in the chat actually. and wonderful stuff. Let me just put in. So if you want to think about philosophy and metaphysics and how does all this add up? Because, I've been a great follower of Eastern mysticism and spirituality, but then combining that with science and understanding of what consciousness is, because we're, in mental health services, we are in the business of trying to understand, grapple with consciousness, but we don't really know what it is. But he's got a really good explanation that helps us to understand that in these wider contexts. So I'd recommend that. So when we're talking about these things, we can go all the way from the spiritual to the societal, to the psychological, and all the way to the political. It goes across all of this, and I just think that it is about who we are at a fundamental level and what we're yearning to get back to. So I think it's a very exciting time, and I think that we can learn a lot from each other. All these different communities who are trying to reconnect to this space, this deeper space, can really do a lot by connecting to each other. So I'm really glad to see the open dialogue community here connecting up with co-intelligence. There's lots of bubbles out there to connect together, because it seems like a deeper movement. It seems like a deeper trajectory that we're on, and it's a very exciting time. So I think today was a really good event in that respect.
Thank you so much, Russell. It's been a really inspiring and really, I feel like you've conveyed some of the depth of open dialogue and of your vision as well for what the ramifications of it are for society. So big thank you to you. So we're coming to the close now of this call, and I'm going to hand over to Natalia. You mentioned, Russell, some of the things there, about coming together, bringing different tribes together. And I think that's very much what we're about here at Co-Intelligence Institute. And Natalia is going to talk about that now.
Yeah, so just first of all, thanks everyone so much for being here and for creating this space of co-learning and exploration. I'm just personally really warmed by that sense that was expressed of this affinity and this shared longing, and so many of the similarities that we have to support both our mental health, but also to support more dialogue and ability to connect and really be heard and hear each other. So just a couple sort of like notes. We host these on the fourth Friday of every month, with different featured guests and different projects that we explore. And they're open to everyone and anyone who's interested in learning more about co-intelligence and in connecting. Next month on October 27th, we're featuring, and can you please say our guest's name, because I'm going to butcher it, Andy.
Len Yin Huang, but he calls himself Mashbing.
Mashbing. So yeah, who is coming from Taiwan's Ministry of Digital Affairs, and they're going to share the story of Taiwan's digital democracy. And so I've posted that link in the chat if you want to register for that, and please feel free to share it with any colleagues or community or family that might be interested. And you're also welcome. We really invite you to subscribe to our newsletter if you want to find out about more events, upcoming events, or learn more about us, the CII, Co-Intelligence Institute. And of course, we're a very small nonprofit, and we welcome any donations to help us continue to bring these calls and make them freely available. And I'll pop our link to donate. Any support really helps. And yeah, so thank you so much for being here with us today. Hope that you guys found it valuable, and I certainly did. Thank you so much, Russell, for sharing this incredible open dialogue. And hopefully we're going to bring more of that to the US. I'll say on a personal note, we can learn from you.
And if I may, someone just asked, are you connected with Healing Justice London, who are doing incredible work in health and social justice? If you have, I'm not sure, maybe some folks here know about them, I don't, but if you have ideas about people that you think we should feature, by all means, send those along as well, because we're continuously open to and looking for people who are doing awesome work that we can host on our real world co-intelligence calls.
Yes, thanks, Rosa.
Thank you, Rosa.
Yeah, and we'll stick around for about the next half hour or so if people want to stay and chat. So you're welcome to stay. And of course, if you have to go, we totally understand. And we're so happy that you were with us for the
Thanks
last
so much.
hour.
I've got to go put the kids to bed, but thanks so much, anyway.
Thank you, Russell.
Lovely to
Thanks
be
so
here.
much.
Thank you, Russell.
Thanks, Russell. Bye.
Thanks,
I
Russell.
know it's evening for everyone in Europe, so we understand if you're ready to get off Zoom.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
So welcome. Thanks for
See
being here.
you. Bye-bye.
Everyone, bye-bye.